For most people, marriage can be a milestone in one's life. It offers many beautiful opportunities. For others, it's something worth pausing to explore and consider before taking the walk down that aisle. And that pause is where this story begins. Welcome to Never Have I Had the Urge to Get Married. How many people out there are planning to get married in 2026? If you are, chances are you're probably thinking about a spring or summer wedding, or maybe an early fall date. In the United States, most weddings tend to happen between late spring and early fall, with months like June, September, and October being especially popular. There's something interesting about that. How marriage follows a kind of seasonal rhythm, as if something we plan for, prepare for, and move toward at just the right time. And that rhythm got me thinking. Now, by no stretch of the imagination am I an expert on marriage. Truth be told, I've never been married, at least not yet. And since no one's asking, I thought I'd start this episode with a brief history of marriage, share a few modern day stats, and talk about why this topic felt worth exploring here. Marriage did not begin with love. I know that's uncomfortable to hear because almost everything we're shown today tells us the opposite. But marriage didn't start with romance or vows or rings or white dresses. It didn't begin in churches or cathedrals or under carefully planned arches. Marriage began in caves, not as a ceremony, but as a way of surviving together. Long before it was emotional, marriage was practical. Long before it was sacred, it was structural. In early human societies, pairing up wasn't about finding the one. It was about survival. Children needed protection. Food needed to be shared. Lineage needed to be clear. In a world without laws, contracts, or even written language, marriage answered a basic question. Who belongs to whom? This wasn't poetry. It was order. As societies grew, marriage evolved into something even less romantic. Families arranged unions not for happiness, but for advantage. Land, livestock, money, and status changed hands. In many cultures, a bride price was paid to a woman's family. In others, a dowry followed her into marriage. Women were often treated less like partners and more like assets, guarantees of lineage, labor, and alliance. Love was optional. Stability was not. Marriage settled debts. It ended feuds. It merged bloodlines. It strengthened clans. And sitting with that history, it can feel uncomfortable. But discomfort doesn't make it untrue. For a long time, marriage wasn't about how you felt. It was about how things functioned. Eventually, power centralized, and marriage changed again. As kingdoms formed and institutions grew stronger, religion stepped in and claimed marriage was sacred ground. What had once been a social arrangement became a moral obligation. Marriage moved from the fire pit to the altar, from private agreement to public sacrament. The church didn't invent marriage, but it formalized it. It regulated it, it sanctified it, and positioned itself as its ultimate authority on it. Marriage became permanent. Divorce became rare, sometimes forbidden. Commitment was no longer just expected, it was enforced, not only by family or tribe, but by God Himself. When marriage gained permanence, it also gained power. In the Middle Ages, marriage was no longer simply a union between two people. It was a binding moral contract enforced by religion, community, and law. Leaving in marriage was nearly impossible. Remarriage was often forbidden. For women especially, marriage could be devastating. A woman's legal identity was often absorbed into her husband's. In many places, she couldn't own property independently, she couldn't vote, she couldn't easily leave. Her labor, her body, her fertility, these were no longer fully her own. they belonged to the marriage. And marriage itself was rarely entered into freely. Most unions were arranged. Age gaps were common. Consent, when it existed, was often symbolic rather than meaningful. A good marriage wasn't defined by happiness or fulfillment. It was defined by obedience, endurance, and stability. The promise wasn't love forever. It was stay forever. And for centuries, that permanence was praised as virtue. But marriage needed to be permanent then because women had very few alternatives. Economic survival depended on it. Social survival depended on it. Leaving could mean poverty, exile, or even death. So when people today say that marriage used to mean something, it's worth asking what it meant and who paid the price for it. As societies modernized, some of that began to change. Women slowly gained legal standing. Property laws shifted. Divorce became possible. Marriage loosened its grip, not because love failed, but because freedom expanded. And that created a problem marriage had never faced before. If people could survive without it, if women could live without it, if love could exist outside of it, then marriage had to justify itself all over again. And that's when the meaning of marriage began to change. Not away from commitment, but towards something else entirely. Me personally, I've never had the urge to get married because all the relationships I've been in worked just fine without it. Some of my relationships over the years were short-lived and some were long-term, all without the need to be married in a church or down at the local city hall. I think, and I could be wrong because I usually am, but somewhere along the way, when marriage became commercialized, when society began teaching us that a church, a long white gown, and a tux with tails were the norm, we lost our way. It was glamorized. It became a fantasy for a lot of people. I've always found it interesting how shows like Bridezilla focus less on the meaning of the wedding and more on control, the details, the perfection, the spectacle. It feels like another sign of how marriage has shifted from something rooted in survival and partnership to something staged, managed, and performed. But relationships are sometimes tough, whether you're legally married or not. They require work, and sometimes a lot of it, especially when certain things hang in the balance, like children and property. This whole thought process around marriage really came to me after realizing that most people who ask me if I'm married or if I've ever been married are genuinely shocked or at least surprised and confused when I say no. They almost always follow it up with the standard, why not? Like I'm supposed to be or should have been. And sometimes people go even further. I've been asked more than once things like, what, are you gay? As if not being married automatically means something about my sexuality. I'm not gay, but I also don't see any issue with being gay. And if two people of the same sex want to get married, they should have every right to do so, just like anyone else who chooses marriage. And it's worth saying out loud, in the United States today, marriage is legally available to couples regardless of gender. That didn't happen by accident. It happened because the idea of marriage continues to evolve away from ownership, away from rigid roles, and towards choice. What that question really revealed to me wasn't confusion about who I am. It was how narrow our ideas around marriage can still be, how quickly people rush to label instead of simply listening. Sometimes I turn the question back around and ask them the same thing. Are you married? Some say yes, some say no, some say divorce. And then I ask the next logical question. How many times have you been married? Sometimes the answer is once, sometimes twice, and sometimes people will say 3, 4, even 5 times. And that's usually the moment they pause, because that's when I say it. What's wrong with me? No. What's wrong with you? Not to be cruel, not to judge, but to point out something that never seems to get questioned. Because for me, if marriage didn't work the first time, or even the second, I've always wondered what the sense is in trying to make the same promise a fourth, a fifth, even maybe a sixth time, I don't know. That conversation, versions of it over and over again, is actually where this all started for me. It's the reason I've never developed the urge to get married. Not out of fear, not out of bitterness, but out of observation. And maybe part of the answer is simple. Most of the women I've been in relationships with over the years felt the same way I did. That marriage wasn't necessary for a relationship to work, or for living together, or even for having children. There was a shared understanding that love and commitment didn't require a contract. There's also a certain flexibility in relationships that don't involve marriage, because sometimes things don't work out. And when they don't, parting ways can be smoother if both people are mature and level-headed. That can happen in a marriage too, but it often becomes more complicated when your local state government is involved. And maybe that's part of why so many people stay in relationships where they're no longer happy or no longer in love. Because remember, in today's society, marriage is supposed to be about love first and everything else second. Which is what keeps bringing me back to that same question. Why get married if you really don't have to? If love, commitment, shared life already exists, what is the contract actually doing? Maybe the better question isn't why people get married, but when and under what assumptions. Because somewhere along the way, marriage stopped being a response to circumstance and started being treated like a default destination. Something you move towards because time is passing, expectations are forming, and to everyone around you seems to be heading in that direction. And when something becomes the default, it rarely gets questioned. What gets lost in the momentum is intention, the quiet work of asking whether a commitment still fits the people making it, whether the reasons are rooted in love, fear, tradition, timing, or simply momentum. That's the space I kept finding myself in. Not opposed, not cynical, just aware that choosing something because it's expected isn't the same as choosing it because it's right. At some point, curiosity led me to the statistics. Not because I was looking for proof, and definitely not because I was trying to label marriage as a failure. I just wanted context. Because numbers don't explain individual lives, but they do show patterns. They show how often people choose marriage, how often they leave it, and how those choices shift depending on age, timing, and circumstance. And what those patterns reminded me of is this. Marriage isn't a guarantee. It's a serious decision that carries real consequences, especially later in life, when there are children, property, and histories already in place. For me, the statistics didn't feel discouraging. They felt grounding, like a quiet reminder that choosing carefully isn't fear, it's intention. So after all of this, after the history, the questions, the assumption, the statistics, the conversations, I think this is where I land. Marriage matters, but it only matters truly if it matters to you. If marriage is important to you, if it's something you value, something you believe in, then it's not something to take lightly. It's something to enter with intention, with honesty, with the understanding that love alone isn't enough. That marriage, if chosen, asks for patience, effort, compromise, and accountability, especially when the things get hard. And if you choose it, you should be ready, willing, and able to do whatever it takes to give it a real chance at success. But if you're not the marrying kind, like me, that doesn't make you broken or afraid or incomplete. It just means your life takes a different shape. You still love, you still commit, you still build, you still show up. And whether you're married or not, the work is still the work. Relationships still require effort. Integrity still matters. Kindness still matters. responsibility still matters. Marriage doesn't create those things. People do. So if you choose marriage, choose it fully. And if you don't, that's okay too. Live your life in a way that's honest to who you are. Care deeply, love sincerely, and do whatever you need to do to be happy, married or not. That's why for me, I've never had the urge to get married. And that's okay. And if there's one thing I hope you take from this episode, it's not an answer, but an invitation. An invitation to pause, to question what you've inherited versus what you actually believe, to choose intentionally whether that choice leads you towards marriage or away from it. Because there's no single path that guarantees happiness. There's only honesty and the courage to live in alignment with who you are. If marriage is part of your story, I hope you enter it with clarity, respect, and commitment. And if it isn't, I hope you feel just as whole, just as valid, and just as free to build a meaningful life on your own terms. Thanks for spending this with me. And as always, behind every want lies an urge. Behind every urge, there's a need. Until next time, thanks for joining me on Never Have I Had the Urge. This show was written and produced by me, your host, Victor Jimenez, and edited by the lovely and talented Invisible Woman. If you've got a never have I had the urge moment you've lived through, questioned, or are still sitting with, you're always welcome to share it. Send it to me at hello@neverhaveihadtheurge.com.